Hi, I'm Caitlin Welsh, Director of the Global Food Security Program at CSIS. Welcome. We're glad you joined us. As we grapple with the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on our own lives and in our own countries, we cannot lose sight of the multi-layered emergency that parts of Africa and Asia are facing today: COVID-19 and desert locust infestations. Indeed, it's a crisis within a crisis. The World Food Program recently projected that COVID-19 will double the number of people at risk of extreme hunger from 130 million to 265 million by the end of this year. Many of the people most at risk are living where desert locusts threaten to devastate crops and agricultural livelihoods. As you may know, in a single day, an average swarm of desert locusts can cover 120 miles and destroy crops sufficient to feed 2,500 people for an entire year. We've designed today's event to give you the latest information about this multi-layered emergency and to discuss the policy responses needed to address the desert locust crisis in Africa and Asia during the pandemic. We're happy to have with us an expert panel. We have Dominique Burgeon, Director of the Emergency and Rehabilitation Division at the UN Food and Agriculture Organization; Stephanie Hansen, Senior Vice President at the One Acre Fund; Matt Nims, Deputy Director of the Office of Food for Peace at USAID; and Stephen Burak, Coordinator of the Regional Desert Locust Alliance. And I'm very pleased to have with us Vimlendra Sharan, Director of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization's Liaison Office for North America. Our event today is part of an ongoing partnership between the CSIS Global Food Security Program and FAO North America. I'll turn it over to Vimlendra in a moment, but first I'd like to give an outline of today's event. Soon we'll receive an overview of the desert locust infestation from Dominique Burgeon. Then at 10:30, I'll turn to our panelists, who will answer a few questions from me and then from you, the audience. If you'd like to submit a question for our audience, please email if you'd like to submit a question from the audience, please email foodsecurity@csis.org. That's foodsecurity@csis.org, or click the Ask Questions Here button on our event page. And then we'll wrap up at 11:15. I'm looking forward to learning from everyone today. And with this, I'm happy to turn the Zoom microphone to our event's co-lead, Vimlendra Sharan of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, to give introductory remarks and to introduce our first speaker. Over to you, Vimlendra.
Thank you, Caitlin, and thank you, CSIS, for co-hosting this event with us as part of a very vibrant partnership we have had over the last couple of years. This is the first one with you, Caitlin, but as we all know, you are no stranger to food security issues, bringing with you decades of experience with the US government, the National Security Council, National Economic Council. Besides, I'm given to understand that you had a long stint in the Department of State's Office of Global Food Security. So I really look forward to a very engaging relationship under your leadership with CSIS. As the coronavirus continues to spread on 6 continents, a crisis within crisis, as Caitlin called it, is brewing in East Africa. And desert locusts, which have inundated East Africa with hundreds of billions of bugs, are causing grave food shortages in Kenya, Somalia, and Ethiopia, and a couple of other countries. I'm sure Dominique and others will speak at great lengths on this, but I just wanted to put the problem in perspective for the understanding for our listeners. The life cycle of a locust is about 3 months. So after every 3 months, the adults are ready to lay eggs again. While many die, for every single female locust, there's about 20 locusts in the new generation that make it. It's an exponential increase. So every 3 months, you have 20 times. Every 6 months, you have 20 squared, which is about 400 times. Every 9 months, you have 20 cubed, which is about 8,000 times. And soon you have swarms, which are in billions. This is the exponential growth of locusts, which have infested parts of Asia and Africa. Locust infestation is not new. It's been happening for years. But the greatest concern this time is where it is occurring. Originating in the empty quarters in Yemen, Oman, Saudi Arabia, these locust swarms have traveled to countries in Horn of Africa, which are extremely vulnerable to any slight disruption in their food security and livelihood. Simply because they've had a series of droughts over the last couple of years, followed by floods and now rains. And on top of that, we have locusts. What is important is for us to understand that these swarms are in countries that either do not have a very robust national program against locusts or do not have them at all. In fact, Kenya, which is greatly impacted, has seen locusts, I believe, only twice in the last 70 years. And so obviously, as would be expected, does not have a very robust national program there. The focus on coronavirus pandemic has taken the spotlight away from locust infestation, gravely impacting food and livelihood security, and it is necessary for us to ensure that this does not become a forgotten cause. To speak on these issues and more and the steps FAO is taking in partnership with other agencies and national governments and agencies, we have with us Director of Emergencies at FAO, Dominique Burgeon. Dominique has over 25 years of professional experience, including in various leadership positions within the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Since 2012, Dominique has served as Director of FAO's Emergency and Resilience Division, and also leads the FAO Corporate Strategic Program on increasing the resilience of agriculture-based livelihoods to threat and crises. He has extensive experience in humanitarian and development assistance, including through his field assignment as FAO rep in Bangladesh, where he oversaw one of FAO's largest country programs, putting into practice the concept of disaster risk management for food and nutrition security. Dominique has also served in Syria and at UN headquarters, and no one better than Dominique to take us through this current crisis, its impact, and the way out. He holds an MSc in Agriculture Engineering and a postgraduate in International Relations and European Integration. With that introduction, let me hand over now to Dominique to really take us through the whole story of how it all began, where it is, and what we at FAO and national governments are doing to mitigate the impact of locusts. Dominique, over to you.
Thank you very much, Vimlendra. Let me share my screen. I hope you can see it. Okay, I hope you can see my screen. So first of all, thank you very much indeed, Caitlin and Lendra for inviting me to this very important event. I think it's not my first time to talk to the CSIS audience. I'm very happy to be there. I'm very happy also to be with such a number of distinguished partners, including some we've been working with very closely, like Matt and others. So very happy to be here today and to indeed talk to on a very important matter for us, something that indeed, as Vimlendra was saying, risk being, I would say, receiving less attention in the context of the current COVID crisis. Just perhaps to set the scene, I would say that last week, FAO, WFP, USAID, FuseNet, and quite a number of partners issued the 2020 edition of the Global Report on Food Crisis, which basically presented the acute food insecurity situation as it appeared in 2019, and where basically we are showing that in 2019, so pre-COVID, pre-locust situation, there were already about 135 million people across 55 countries that were in acute food insecurity. So the type of food insecurity that requires humanitarian assistance and where people basically have to cut the number, quality of meals, and even sometimes go to a point where they have to sell their assets to cope. So extreme hunger. So 135 million people with an additional also 183 million people at the border of this acute food insecurity, which shows that indeed the number of WFP 265 is coherent when you look at the number of people you had on the verge of acute food insecurity. So when it comes to the situation, you see that, of course, the bulk of people in acute food insecurity are living in Africa. And if you even zoom further to Eastern Africa, where the locust outbreak is currently occurring, you see that indeed in the 6 IGAD member states, there were indeed 27 million people in acute food insecurity pre-COVID and again pre-desert locust outbreaks. So, and I think it's important to realize that East Africa is about 20% of the total number worldwide. So it's a real hotspot in terms of acute food insecurity. When we look at the evolution of the desert locust upsurge, and Dimlendra already touched on it in his introductory remark, when he basically said that this whole situation started essentially in an area called the Empty Quarter in the Arabic Peninsula towards mid-18, where this is an area that is extremely difficult to reach and very difficult to do assessment, very difficult to treat, and where for about 9 months locusts have been breeding. And then towards a couple of months later, they start moving, essentially by early 2019, they started moving in several directions. First towards indeed Yemen, but then also towards Saudi Arabia and towards Iran. Of course, the focus of discussion is more on East Africa, where the situation is most acute. And for that, what happened is that indeed in Yemen, they found relatively good condition which allowed for another cycle of breeding. And by the summer 2019, essentially, they moved towards indeed Ethiopia and northern Somalia. There, they had another cycle of breeding. And at this point, they would normally, during the summer, they would normally dry out, and the population would sort of regulate itself, especially that there were already massive control operations that they were ongoing by the countries themselves. But what happened is that this year, in 2019, towards the end of 2019, we had a massive cyclone Pawan, that hit early on the 17th of December 2019, and that brought a huge quantity of water, therefore allowing a new cycle of desert locust, which led to a situation where that created very good conditions for breeding, and therefore the invasion of essentially Kenya, Ethiopia, with huge quantities of indeed desert locust breeding. Now, when we look at the current situation, we see that the current situation in East Africa in particular remains extremely alarming as swarms continue to mature. And I would say the situation we have been facing is that as we speak, and in March, there has been very large quantities of water across East Africa that have created very good conditions for continued breeding. So despite the fact that there has been increasingly important control operations that have taken place, the threat to food security is there and remains very high. There has been also, talking of other regions, very good conditions especially very good conditions in terms of desert locust breeding, of course, in Iran and in other parts of Asia, but essentially Iran. Therefore, again, allowing for massive breeding and therefore a threat to also not only Iran, but also moving of swarms moving towards Pakistan and India. So now, when we look at indeed the crop calendar in East Africa in particular, you see that we are now towards the end of April, which basically coincides with the beginning of the long rain and of the planting season in the area. So while there's been, of course, as I was saying, ground and aerial control operations that have taken place or are in progress in the region, the fact that there has been very good rains in late March will allow new swarms, will allow a new generation of locusts to come. This new generation is going to lay eggs, and referring to the life cycle that Vimlendra was talking about before, the risk is that they will form new locusts, new immature locusts towards June, July, which will coincide with the harvest season, therefore continuing to put a real risk for the plant production and food production in the region. So, what has been the approach of FAO since the beginning of this crisis? Essentially, we based our response on the recommendations that came out of the last time we had such a situation, which was in 2003, 2005 in the Sahel, when there was a similar upsurge. And the recommendation from that was that we should have, I would say, a two-track approach, combining not only desert locust control operations, but in the meantime, operations to safeguard livelihoods of farmers, but also livestock herders. And this is why, right from the beginning, we have been adopting what we call an anticipatory approach, saying, well, let's focus on control operations to start with, while at the meantime, we, of course, monitor very closely the situation and are able to address potential deterioration of the food security situation. And this is why there has been also a lot of discussion in the context of the Global Network Against Food Crisis, which is indeed an alliance of partners involving quite a large number of partners, where we indeed review the situation together and try to promote also anticipatory action and longer-term solutions to that sort of situation. So now, when it comes to the first component of our action, which is indeed on controlling desert locust population, I need to be very clear. I mean, the fact is that FAO is there to augment capacities of the government in the regions. I think we are not operating in isolation. We are there to augment the capacities of the government. As a matter of fact, there's been very large areas that have been treated by the government themselves across all the countries, and this is why until December, this was really under control. Now the situation has become, since January, I would say, overwhelming, and government have been seeking international community's assistance, and this is in that context that we support. Our support takes various forms in terms of augment capacities for surveillance. I mean, you cannot, the challenge of locust operations is that you need to spot your targets to be able to act, to basically find the right places to spread. So you need surveillance capacities, then you need control capacities in the form of ground operations or aerial operations, such as with the plane that you see there, and of course pesticides, protective equipment, and so on and so forth. I think we are now at a stage where we are making very, very preliminary assessment. I mean, as we keep doing the work, we try to regularly assess the impact. And from our very preliminary analysis, we see that so far, with the the operations that we have been doing, we have been protecting about 700,000 metric tons of cereal that have been protected, which is enough food to feed about 5 million people for a year. I'm saying the operations currently as far as we have been going. So now there are more detailed assessments ongoing, but I think this is quite encouraging to say that. One of the points related, of course, to the impact of COVID. I mean, indeed, COVID is definitely a complicating factor. And but what I have to stress here is that government have been, of course, treating this emergency as a priority, and therefore making all possible efforts to enable us and to facilitate the continuation of locust control operations. This said, there has been a number of changes, and FAO right from the beginning has adopted an approach where we were sort of sharing the risk by I would say, spreading the risk by using a variety of suppliers across the world, which so far has enabled us to keep the flow of inputs, the flow of equipment going, and there has been no disruption in the supply chain of equipment, even if, yes, there has been some challenges in some pilots for helicopters for South Africa being quarantined or delaying the supplies of pesticides from India or that sort of thing, but solutions have always been found. Now, when I come to the other part of our assistance, which is livelihood savings, livelihood protection activities, so to basically assist the communities that have been that have been affected by the locust populations, it takes different forms. And basically, we are now at a stage where we are at the beginning of the season and where we are preparing for the assistance to these communities. Looking at the crop calendar, you see that basically we are now going to enter the lean season in a number of areas, where therefore we'll have a combination as of June of cash intervention together a bit later on towards August with the provision of agricultural inputs to really try to boost agricultural production wherever it is possible. In the same way, we are going to support, of course, not only the farmers, but also the pastoralists. You know that in that part of the world, about 50% of the rural population depend on pastoralism for their livelihood. Therefore, I mean, of course, locusts do not differentiate between crop and pasture. They also eat the pasture, and therefore there is an impact on pastoralism, hence the need to support these communities during the lean season, essentially with feed and veterinary support to indeed protect their main source of life. Now, if I go to my last slide, essentially looking at the forecast, basically you see that there is still a very strong threat in the Horn of Africa, a threat that is most probably going to last for a couple more months. But in the meantime, with movement of locust population to other countries that are where there will be an increasing risk, especially Sudan. Sudan is a country that is really regularly threatened by locust population. So we need to remain attentive there, and we need to remain supportive of the government in their effort, especially that if we do not manage to control in Sudan, if it reaches Sudan, there is a potential threat to West Africa, and this is something that is being flagged on several occasions. The threat remains in Yemen remains, and then as you can see, I mean, locusts can fly a very long distance, and therefore there can be from East Africa also a threat going to Asia, especially Pakistan and even India. So this is why we need to remain very vigilant. We need to beef up our interventions, and this is why there will be in the coming 2 days a revision of the appeal that we have issued, basically presenting new needs, not only in terms of control operations, but also new needs in terms of livelihood support interventions, considering that basically the situation we are facing is, I would say, less optimal than the best case scenario we were planning for. And therefore, there will be a need for continued and even strengthened support in the coming weeks and months. This is what I wanted to share, Kathleen. There is plenty of information that you can find online, which is updated almost real time, and I would invite people to attend. Thank you very much. You are mute, Kathleen.
Caitlin, you are muted.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Dominique for that presentation. It was incredibly rich, and I think that it's the first time that many of us were hearing this information. So thank you again, Dominique. We will have some follow-up questions for you following our panel. So we'll come back to you in a few minutes with some questions. And again, thank you. I'd like to turn to our panel discussion and start by introducing Stephanie Hansen, Senior Vice President of the 1 Acre Fund. Stephanie is Senior Vice President for Policy and Partnerships at the 1 Acre Fund. 1 Acre Fund is a social enterprise that serves 1 million smallholder farmers in Africa. She's been with the 1 Acre Fund for over 10 years and manages the organization's government relations and policy, internal and external communications, and microfinance partnerships. Prior to 1 Acre Fund, Stephanie covered economic and political development in Africa and Latin America with the Council on Foreign Relations. And a certified leadership coach, Stephanie is based in New York City and joins us from New York City today. Stephanie, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Great. So I have a handful of questions for you, and I wanted to turn to you first so that you could take us from the 30,000-foot level that Dominique gave us to the ground level, because as I mentioned, 1 Acre Fund serves 1 million smallholder farmers in Africa. My first question for you is, based on your organization's experience, how is the locust infestation affecting smallholder farmers' activity today?
So 1 Acre Fund is serving about 400,000 farmers in Kenya, and we've been carefully monitoring how locusts are impacting their farms. We have a network of thousands of field staff in Kenya, and we're using that network to track locust sightings. And then if we have enough field reports, we send teams out to conduct ground spraying of the locust hopper bands. We've been doing this work in collaboration with the Ministry of Agriculture in Kenya, because unfortunately, there's not a lot that individual farmers can do to mitigate the impact of locusts. They're really best tackled at a regional level through a coordinated government response and through aerial spraying. Farmers are really continuing with their farming activities as much as they can. As Dominique mentioned, this is the start of the long rains. Farmers are planting right now, so they've been focused on first procuring input, seed and fertilizer, and then planting their fields with staple food crops like maize. In recent weeks, coronavirus movement restrictions have impacted the ability of some farmers to bring small vegetable crops to market to sell, which is reducing an additional income stream at a time when farmers do really need that money to be saving for potential risk from things like locusts.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Stephanie. And thanks for giving us some information about how just the actual daily impact of the COVID restrictions on farmers' activities on top of the locust infestations. What measures do you see farmers taking to try to mitigate the impact of locusts on their operations in the months to come, like looking into the summertime?
Yeah, so really for an individual farmer, the number one way to mitigate locust risk is to just reduce the amount of money that you're spending on seed and fertilizer to plant. Everyone has been very closely following the reports of locusts on the radio. That's the primary way that most farmers are receiving information. And in Kenya, there has been a lot of critical media coverage of the Kenyan government response. And you could argue about whether that's fair or not, but the government has been open that they have have experienced some slowdowns in supply chain of critical pesticides from China due to coronavirus. So in some cases, that has slowed their ability to conduct aerial spraying. And so as a result of this coverage, some people just may have decided in February, I'm just not going to invest as much in my farm this year to try to mitigate the risk of this very unpredictable natural disaster event. For farmers who are lucky enough to have access to it, crop insurance is a great way to mitigate risk. It's something that One Acre Fund provides to all of our customers in Kenya through a really great partnership with the Ministry of Agriculture. They subsidize the premium, which is great. But many millions of farmers in Kenya are not insured. And that means that the support that FAO is planning to provide to many farmers in the region is absolutely critical, because the geographic area that locusts will end up covering is somewhat unpredictable, and we need a way to compensate farmers who are affected by losses. Most farmers just don't have a safety net to fall back on when natural disaster strikes, and every time you lose a harvest, your appetite for risk and long-term investments in your farm is negatively affected. If you're a farmer and you've made it one or two rungs up the ladder toward prosperity, something like locusts, combined with the likely impact of coronavirus, can really take you just right back down to the bottom of the ladder in a matter of months.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. And that's a good segue to another question that I have for you, which is what will be the lasting repercussions, you think, for farmers after the locust infestation is gone, after this locust infestation is gone?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that uncertainty in an agriculture supply chain really can be contagious. And so when farmers experience uncertainty in one season and that infects their investment decisions and then their income, whether you directly are impacted by locusts or not, you might realize a smaller profit that year. You might then start thinking differently about your next season investment because you're not sure what's going to happen. And then people's concerns about coronavirus are layered into that. Because of the economic impact of coronavirus, we're already seeing reduced remittances coming in, both from overseas and within countries, so from urban to rural areas. And so many farmers do rely on that additional income stream to make upfront investments at the start of the season. So I am expecting this to impact investment choices that farmers are making in the field for more than a single season, for sure, particularly given the dual impact of locusts and COVID.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Stephanie. We'll come back to you with some follow-up questions, but thanks very much for that information you laid out for us.
You're welcome.
We could turn next to Matt Nims. Matt, thanks so much for joining us today. Matt is Deputy Director of USAID's Office of Food for Peace. He has over 17 years of international development and emergency programming experience. He began his USAID career in Indonesia, where he worked for 3.5 years managing and overseeing development and emergency food assistance programs. Matt has a master's in international public health from Emory University, and he is joining us today from Washington, D.C.
Thanks, Caitlin. Hello, everybody. Great to see everybody. Great to meet Stephen and Stephanie virtually, and great to see the FAO team. Always a pleasure to see you all. And again, Caitlin, welcome to the food security I don't know, you've already been doing this for a while, but welcome to the CSIS side of that. And again, thanks a lot to CSIS for this opportunity.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. And I want to thank you again, Matt, for joining us, particularly given the many demands on your time right now. So to start off, I'd just like to ask you, how is USAID responding to the locust infestations that we've heard about in the near term?
Okay, thanks for that question. I think we do view this definitely as a crisis inside of a crisis. I think Dominique said that. I thought that was really, really telling. The outbreak is definitely an urgent concern for USAID. We've been there, I think, since the beginning, working on this in conjunction with our partners. So thus far, we've provided at least nearly $20 million, mostly to FAO, of humanitarian assistance money. There's other elements of aid as well funding into that. But this was to support the regional efforts to control the locusts, especially in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia. Those, I think, have been the big focus, with the obvious focus on detection, surveillance, ground-based and aerial control operations, but also some training, safe use of pesticides, equipment like radio, GPS, training, e-locust tablets, vehicles, just even the aircrafts to get that. Again, all with FAO. I thought a really good point that Dominique made was this is in a sense in conjunction with the local and with the government efforts there. That's really an important aspect of this. It's not that we're starting from scratch. We're with FAO and the other partners working to bolster the government's abilities to do this as well, the host governments that are being infected. I think Dominique very much, highlighted this is a pretty important time right now to try to break this cycle. And I think focus now in those places is important. And hopefully our funding and the efforts will coincide to be able to make an impact on that. It is difficult, to predict. You all scientists in the field and everything else know more than I, but where the next one's going to come, how this is going to go. So having those really robust surveillance efforts in place, I think, are going to prove very, very, very important. We here at AID and in Food for Peace, which is soon going to be the Bureau for Humanitarian Affairs, so we are joining with our sister office, the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance. I think that's going to happen relatively soon. But the transition in this type of arena will be, I think, very seamless. Efforts will continue to support that. We will be continuing to talk to you all, to our partners, to figure out how that goes.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much, Matt. Next question for you is, how is COVID-19 affecting your response to locusts in the places you're working?
Well, I think that's going to be a continual impact. But I mean, simply just travel restrictions, border closures, supply chain, which I think is actually just getting started. We're actually in the U.S. having a little bit of that, but I think some of the impacts overseas could be quite substantial. I think. It's going to continue to morph, and I think that there are lots of scenario planning on this from many different levels, from the individual local NGOs to the INGOs to our UN organizations on how to do this. And I think having a degree of flexibility to be able to position ourselves well to account for this is going to be crucial. And I think another really important aspect is with COVID coming, everybody's going to have to try to balance what is important. And I think our current situation with the locust outbreak is incredibly important to balance that with also COVID. And I think, being able to continue essential humanitarian operations within, not just all in one thing, but also looking at the broader, this includes nutrition, this includes locusts, this includes feeding that's already going on. How do we operate within that dynamic of COVID? Luckily, there's a lot of smart people out there who are doing these things. One of the colleagues on a colleague on the team, on the Locust team, was talking, about the crucialness of surveillance and spraying. Well, we need pilots. We need pilots to be able to get out there. So if a country blankets not allowing pilots to go do their job, well, that's going to impact this. And so how do we work with governments to say, we understand this, but in this sense, we need to be open to developing the best response to try to take advantage of what we have ready to go, but also to be cognizant of the COVID. It's going to be a delicate, I think, balance as we go forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And Matt, I'd like to build on one of the things that you mentioned at the beginning, which is your partnership with USAID. But could you talk a little bit about how USAID is coordinating with others, with partner countries, with other donors, maybe multilateral organizations in the fight against these swarms? Because we've heard this echoed many times, that it's the response is cross-border and it needs to be coordinated.
I think that is crucial, and I think we need to at actually multiple levels. I will say that even within USAID, so we've got the soon-to-be Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance. We've also got our partners at the Feed the Future initiative, and I think making sure that we're at first on the same page, and I think we really do. Feed the Future has done some tremendous research on this, some tremendous coming together and helping FAO early on, even more than 18 months ago, to establish some of the good research that's needed on this on pesticide. We've also been able to, I think, do a lot of the training necessary for local governments. FAO, with some of our own funding, as well as through other aspects of aid, I think have really set a pretty good foundation. We're going to need more, but a good foundation of technical staff out there in the field, how to use the pesticides, how to surveil, and how to get this going. And I think this is going to serve us well as we go forward. The longer term support for the national governments and the regional approach is going to continue, I think, from all the donors. I'm hopeful. AID has been part of that since the beginning, and I think that'll continue. The regional desert locust control initiative, I think, was just like in 16 countries, Red Sea, East Africa, Middle East. That is a good body that has been strengthened by this, and I think that'll be a good partner that AID will be looking at, a mechanism to continue to support. And then again, some of our own domestic research institutes have been able to be part of this as well. Arizona State University, even here in Virginia Tech has got some pretty good pest management, and hopefully those innovations, those changes will continue to be used in the field in that way. On food security in general, I mean, this was not a good year. I mean, as Dominique put up the global report, you can also look at the Fuse report. This was going to be a stressed year with the level of conflict, with the level of market conditions existing in the world anyway. And then with Locust on top of that, and now with COVID, this is going to be a really challenging, one of probably the worst we look back on in quite a while. So I think the continuing impacts on food security globally, especially in some of those fragile countries, that more susceptible to climatic issues like locusts, like this, is going to be severe, is what we anticipate. So, good communication, being able to target where we need to, both in locusts, both in COVID, both in food security, I think is going to be crucial.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Matt. If it is the year that you're mentioning that others are predicting it's going to be, then I'm glad that we have people like you and other people involved in our event today on the task. So thank you for your work, and we'll come back to you with some follow-up questions.
Well, thank you, Caitlin.
Yeah, thank you. And finally, I'd like to turn to Stephen Burak. Stephen is coordinator for the Regional Desert Locust Alliance, and he's project development manager for ACTED, an NGO whose mission is to save lives and support people in meeting their needs in hard-to-reach areas. Stephen is based in Nairobi, Kenya, and received a master's degree in development management from the London School of Economics. Hi, Stephen.
Hi, Caitlin. Pleasure to be here today.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us. I'd like to start just with an intro question for you and for the Regional Desert Locust Alliance. Can you just introduce RDLA? Tell us a little bit about its members, when it was formed, and what its goals are.
Yeah, absolutely. So in February of this year, a group of NGOs, ACTED, Oxfam, Concern, the Norwegian Refugee Council, and Johannita, came together because we saw a gap in the response to the desert locust crisis, in particular in terms of food security and livelihoods. So in identifying this, we then opened up a group to now have over 30 NGOs that are operating in 8 countries in the Greater Horn of Africa, focused on food security as well as livelihoods. Part of the key thing that we're doing within this is ensuring advocacy, that the urgency and the needs of people throughout these countries is understood and is being addressed, and that the components around food security and livelihoods are understood in terms of the nuances, so that we can understand the issues that are at hand and appropriate responses for them. From there, it leads into the next 2 key parts of the RDLA. Beyond advocacy, what we're trying to ensure for the NGO community and the wider humanitarian community, as well as governments at a national, local, and a regional level, is that our approach is well coordinated, that we understand who is doing what where, we understand where the gaps are, and that the response that we have, which is coming together, is appropriate for what's at hand. And finally, what we're trying to bring together is that the approaches that we have are harmonized and technically sound programming. I think particularly within this area, for desert locust response in the Greater Horn of Africa, it is relatively novel for this generation of humanitarian workers, as well as for even senior government officials. So this is a new crisis laid on top of a number of other crises that we see on a year-on-year basis across the region, from conflict as well as floods and the wider effects of climate change.
Okay, Great, thank you, Stephen. It seems like coordination is in the DNA of the RDLA. I'd just like to give you to give an example of how RDLA is coordinating with other actors in the field to fight these infestations. So can you perhaps choose a country or a part of a country and tell us what it looks like on the ground, that coordination?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the best exercises that we've done most recently is a mapping exercise across the region of what all of our members are currently doing in terms of food security and livelihood response for the desert locust. Now, this is quite broad. So at this regional level, what we are seeing is understanding what projects have already started in terms of food security and livelihood support, as well as what is planned in the future, and understanding the gaps in terms of the locations where communities aren't being served or prepared to be served, or where there's actually the services being provided. So with that information, we're working with the donor community, with FAO, with OCHA, as well as with governments to ensure that our actions are well coordinated and are starting to meet the needs of people on the ground. So most recently, I was at a presentation with the regional body for the Greater Horn of Africa, IGAD, where I was talking about the need for access. Now, for the NGO community, slightly different to the United Nations agencies, we are still facing, because of COVID-19, measures which are extremely important to protect public health, but are also limiting our access to undertake desert locust response. So we are advocating strongly at this level to ensure that we have access. So what we are currently doing and what we have planned can occur, because there have been many programs which have been suspended or altered because of the current crisis. And it's definitely going to have an impact on communities throughout the region.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Stephen. And I think that's a great segue to my last question for you. Besides money, what do you think is necessary to drive an effective response to the infestations? And I'll ask, besides money and access, which you just spoke about. So besides those two things, what do you think are keys to an effective response?
We need to be early. I think what Dominique was saying before, and what we've learned from the Sahel, what we've learned from Madagascar, is that our response needs to come early for food security and livelihoods. So this is very much a key pillar for the work of the RDLA. And in doing this, we are speaking to the donor community, speaking to governments, trying to engage in internal fronts from NGOs to start to mobilize quickly. Key also within this is that the programs that we have that are addressing food security and livelihoods, which are within these locust hotspots, are prepared to understand and respond to the nuances of issues that come from desert locusts, so that we understand that members have the key information of what are the effects of desert locusts if you're already working with a pastoralist community, or if you're working with sedentary farmers. So getting this key technical knowledge to our members, and even more broadly to the wider humanitarian community, to the government, so that we can have a well-coordinated response.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Stephen. We'll return to you with a few follow-up questions momentarily. At this point, I'd like to open it up to the whole panel. And I'd like to begin with some follow-up questions from Dominique Burgeon from the UN Agriculture Organization. Dominique, thank you again. Thank you very much for the presentation that you gave. Based on the information that you just heard from Stephanie, Matt, and Stephen, do you have any follow-up information you'd like to provide us, or any questions you'd like to ask?
No, I think a lot has been said. I think, of course, we are very grateful for the support we receive from USAID. I think there are a few important things that came out in terms of this two-track approach. Yes, we need to control, but in the meantime, we need to support the livelihood of communities. To support the livelihood of communities, we need to understand the impact. I think it's understanding the impact of the desert locust and what are the communities that are threatened. We are much better equipped today to do that, and this is why we are working together as a community. We are talking, of course, we are very much engaging with the NGOs in the context of the food security cluster, as well in the various countries, as well as at sub-regional level in the context of the food security nutrition working group, which we co-lead together with IGAD, but then also, of course, a permanent dialogue with the partners like USA. We do not only have, I would say, weekly conversations on how we can support each other, but we have also regular interaction with the entire community so that there is full transparency in terms of what is the situation and what are the challenges that we are facing and what are the solutions we are facing. Indeed, we are identifying. Indeed, the COVID is a complicating factor. We cannot ignore it, especially when it comes to the livelihood component. You know that one of the, we had about 2 weeks ago, we had the FAO had a very big meeting with all African Union ministers, as well as the African Union Commission, and for all the region. They said that in the context of the COVID, one of their priority is to make sure that indeed the planting seasons are not being missed, and that agricultural inputs are timely supplied to the farmers so that they can plant and that we are not missing the seasons. This is on the supply side. The other part, which is very important also, is of course making sure people continue to have access to food, and that's why there were a couple of comments that were made on the importance of, for example, the social protection systems and the cash interventions that we are promoting that are very important to make sure that people can still access the market. So I think we are all on the same page, and the coordination is going well among the actors around this virtual Zoom table.
Thank you. Dominique, I'd like to ask for an update on the status of the funding appeal from the UN FAO. You mentioned that it's going to be revised soon. So if you're able to give us a preview in terms of how you think that will be revised, and also how are we doing against the latest target that the FAO had set, which I believe is $153 million.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Caitlin, for that. The appeal, we started back in January when we launched the first appeal, it was 70 million. And then as the situation was evolving, we indeed added new countries and new region. The last appeal also includes Yemen and Sudan, for example, and this is why we have 153 million as a ask, with the two components. The component on control is fairly well funded. The one on livelihood is only 50% funded. So this is where we have a big gap for the moment. But now with this new generation coming, we know that the component on control will need to be maintained and even further expanded, also adding needs in other countries in East Asia, including Pakistan and Iran, where there is indeed a situation. So we are going to increase those needs in about 10 days to 2 weeks. Will increase of about 50 million, in the range of 50 million more needed on control operations, and over 100 million needed for livelihood operations at the top of the current gap. So it means we have quite a significant gap on the livelihood component, a gap that, of course, is exacerbated, I would say, by the COVID situation, and which needs urgent attention. So we will issue a more comprehensive document in the next 10 days also.
Good, thank you, Dominique. That's quite significant. I'd like to turn to Stephanie, Matt, and Stephen. To whoever would like to take this question, I'm curious about the impact of the locust infestations on pastoralists. We've talked a lot about the impact on farmers. Can we just take another look and talk about how pastoralists are being affected in these countries? To anyone who'd like to take it, Matt, do you have any information you can provide?
I actually thought Steve had a good. I thought Steve was going to go first, and I can jump on.
Great.
Okay. So I think one of the key things we're seeing for pastoralist communities is understanding the impact of this mobile group. What we understand is that with these rains, it's prime conditions to really encourage the desert locust to hatch and then to breed further. And the browse and the pasture is being consumed by these new swarms, which will be coming in the next month. What we have to be responding to in this situation is understanding the multiple impacts from this occurring. because when you start to affect pastoralist communities, the body condition of the animals begins to reduce. They begin to displace. And if you even look at a household level, the nutrition for family members begins to reduce. So you start to have a nutrition insecurity. If there's insufficient milk because there's insufficient food for livestock, we have a multitude of issues that arise from that. So we can see that from this very unique and large group across the Greater Horn of Africa, you really need to have a tailored response for them to understand those conditions. And beyond just the livelihood support, it's understanding that we are doing livestock monitoring, that we are tracking where people are moving, and also tracking where the locusts are moving, bringing all of that information and having a tailored response.
Okay, great. Thank you, Stephen. Matt, anything to add to that?
Yeah, not much, Stephen. That was great. I mean, I think that pastoralists are traditionally, a very vulnerable group in this region in general that we're talking about, the Horn. And with the heavy rains, we have seen, I think, a good amount of fodder out there. And I don't think many of our partners are seeing a dramatic impact at this time. But this is something that we're definitely watching. I think this is where a COVID impact could also be pretty severe if we're restricting markets, if things can't be shipped, if we don't have good or even just existing type of market flow, that's going to be problematic. One of my colleagues was talking that, unlike smallholder farmers, pastoralists can try to move and get out of this and look for fodder in other places and try to do that. And that might mitigate some of this. But I think the big picture is, this is a vulnerable group. This, impacts that hit them lead to other implications that go down in the food security chain. This is something that we're watching and I think bears close attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Matt. Dominique, I think that you have something to add here quickly before we turn to the audience for questions.
No, quickly, of course. I think I'm glad you asked the question on pastoralism. This is a community that is traditionally neglected. I mean, humanitarian assistance, agriculture is often difficult to sell. But within agriculture, support to pastoralism is often even more complicated. I think what we have to realize also is that there is always the risk of even conflict. Pastoralist communities sometimes have to move towards a non-traditional transhumance movement. Therefore, we need to be able to monitor that, and we need to be able to avoid tension that may emerge. This is why, for example, at FAO, we are working very closely with IGAD on a number of clusters in East Africa, and also with the Peace Building Commission of the UN to try to diffuse tension among pastoralists and resident communities that may emerge in that sort of situation. So support to pastoralists is absolutely critical in this context.
Thank you very much, Dominique. I appreciate that. I want to turn now to questions from our audience, and we've had some great questions in so far. First question that I'll mention is from Ambassador Kip Tom, the U.S. ambassador to the Rome-based agencies. And I'll ask two questions. The first one is, what steps are being taken to digitize the response to this crisis to improve immediate outcomes and long-term response strategies? So I'll pose that to anyone. Perhaps Stephanie, do you have examples of that in your experience?
Yeah, a couple of good examples. And Dominique mentioned that, and I think the link might have even been at the end of his presentation, to the FAO portal providing data on surveillance. And that's a real-time portal. It's updated not just with data from FAO, but from a number of partners. One Acre Fund actually feeds data into that system. There's a company called Grow Intelligence that is monitoring and doing surveillance, also in collaboration with a number of other actors. And I think particularly in the age of COVID, digitization is even more important because some of the field reports, which might have been taken on paper or done firsthand in conversation between a farmer and an extension worker, a farmer and, in One Acre Fund's case, a field officer, now need to be done over the phone, on a tablet, things like that. So I think to the extent that it's possible for rollout rollout of tools like smartphones and tablets for frontline agriculture extension workers, either private sector or employed by the government. That is an important tool for surveillance because, as Stephen pointed out, speed is of the essence in the control response.
Okay, great. Stephanie. Stephen, what's your experience with this, with digitalization?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things we see throughout the Horn of Africa is the use of mobile phones, particularly mobile money. And what we are advocating for strongly as part of the food security response is to continue and reinforce the use of cash-based responses. Key part of this is not just the ability to quickly get money into people's pockets, but also we can limit contact as well. So in this COVID-19 setting, we're able to reduce our contact with the communities that we're serving. But in saying that, as you change these steps, you're having to adapt your programs quite rapidly to ensure that the accountability remains the same, that the ability for the feedback to come from communities remains there, and that vulnerable groups that we are serving still continue to have that voice.
Okay, great. Thank you, Stephen. Second question from Ambassador Tom in Rome is about coordination with the FAO. Ambassador Tom notes that in some situations, coordination between the FAO and African governments is weak, and in some cases, it's very good. What are we doing to harmonize coordination in the countries that need improvement? And I'll pose that to Dominique and ask Matt for any additional observations.
Well, I would like, of course, to thank the ambassador for his question. We always have an extremely good dialogue with the permanent representative in the US mission to the Rome-based agencies in Rome, and including on Locust operations, of course. Well, coordination with government. I think an organization like FAO, we have been working in most of these countries for over 40 years. I mean, we are doing primarily development work, but of course, I mean, what characterizes an organization like FAO is that we are able to stay, and we are always at the side of the government, even during difficult times. And this is done through constant dialogue. Well, quality of the dialogue, of course, varies. But to my knowledge, in this particular case, we are really in full consultation. I was in Kenya in January. We were together with the permanent secretary of the Ministry of Agriculture, reviewing the situation, defining the needs. A couple of weeks later, it was with the Minister of Agriculture of Somalia, where I think we have, I mean, the key is really that we are there to augment the capacities of the government, and therefore seeing how we can do that. Also having an important capacity development component, which for us is absolutely critical. As was said by Vinendra, I think some of these countries have not seen such a situation in 70 years. So it means that they lack a lot of capacities. Therefore, we have a role in also training the new generations of responders. And this is one of the main things we are doing. Therefore, working on the short term, agreeing on the plan, but also on the longer term, trying to indeed plan for what could be in view also of climate change, the new normal in the region.
Okay, thank you, Dominique. And Matt, what's your experience with coordination with FAO and with countries in Africa that are affected?
Well, first of all, great to get a question from Ambassador Tom to know he's still doing okay out there in Rome as well. And I do pass on my greetings. I think it is correct to say that there's been uneven progress or uneven relationships, and that's true in development as well as in emergency. And I think that's something that we should all be working on. I think in terms of that relationship and building towards the longer term efforts that I talked a little bit about building that local, that host government ability to have the training, to have the practices, to have that ability to do that. And I think, as Dominique said, that can atrophy over time depending on it. And so a continued focus that FAO plays a big role in. I think USAID missions overseas. In USAID, the Feed the Future the Feed the Future initiative is really best led by the new Bureau for Resilience and Food Security that we're a sister bureau with the Bureau of Humanitarian Affairs. And I think they are doing a lot of work on this, on ensuring that in those missions in the field, that there is this good integration, that there is good training in the technical expertise. And I think that needs to be further honed. I think that needs to be better coordinated as we go forward. I think that's something that everybody shares on that. I think that there's ample room for the digitization, the technical aspect that Stephen and Stephanie talked about, with tools FAO has, as well as other tools that are out there. Ambassador Tom is very expert on so many of the digital tools that are out there that I think need to be better proliferated into these places where we work.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks very much, Matt. So I think everyone has a great sense from the conversations we've had so far about the scale of this challenge and the scope of this challenge. And there are organizations that have information and capacity that they'd like to lend to this fight. So our next question is from an organization called Cultivating New Frontiers in Agriculture, or CNFA. And CNFA asks, how can implementers like CNFA that currently have operations in these countries and have expertise in pest response management support efforts by FAO and others?
Well, I guess I could come.
Yeah, that'll be for Dominique, and then perhaps for Stephen as well for follow-up from the RDLA.
No, thank you very much. I mean, as we were saying, I mean, there is a lot of coordination there, and that FAO, together with the World Food Programme, is at global level co-leading the food security cluster, which is basically the place where all the stakeholders engaged in food security, be it food assistance or livelihood support, are coordinating and are agreeing, I would say, in broad terms, in the activities that need to be undertaken to have a coordinated response, and where we also, I would say, do one of the key functions of the cluster, which is agreeing on who does what, where, and when, and making sure that there is no gap. So I would think that participating, getting engaged in the food security cluster, getting engaged at the level of the food security nutrition working group that is active in the region is the best way to meet with the various actors and contribute to a well coordinated effort that we are trying to promote.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dominique. And anything to add from your perspective, Stephen?
I fully agree with the engagement with these, with the food security clusters at this regional level and at national level, and also to reach out to the RDLA. I'm sure if you contact through to CSIS, they'll pass on my contact information, and I welcome all emails and contact, and happy to increase the size of our membership so that our coordination can also strengthen. So I welcome anyone who's watching today or in the future to don't hesitate to reach out. I'm happy to have a conversation on how we can work together.
Good. Thank you, Stephen. I have a great question from Arizona State University. This person asks, in the context of sheltering in place, how can the global research community support the response and resilience building efforts? And in specific, what are some key questions that need to be addressed? So for those who want to be assisting right now, who are sheltered in place and have capacity to do to assist with research efforts, what are some gaps they could help fill? Matt, anything from you?
I was just thinking, like, first of all, I assume it's the same Arizona State University folks that through the Feed the Future are already helping developing some of this. As far as the gaps, I don't want to give a technical direction at all over this, and I'm sure I would want our friends at Resilience and Food Security Bureau to do that. But I mean, I think that just the fact that you are there, that you are engaged, that you're doing this, I think is great. And of course, if you aren't getting at least enough information from the USAID side, please talk to your folks there, talk to us, and we'll definitely be available, because I think that now is crucial to be able to find some potentially new innovations like that you're going to be able to operate in this environment where you are in Arizona, and then what we're seeing in the field as well. So I'm sure that there's lots of opportunities out there.
Okay, great. Thank you, Matt. Stephanie.
So this is a slight adjustment to the question that was asked, but I think it's important to note that it's really important for advocacy to be happening with national governments about the kinds of movements that should be allowed by farmers and others who are tackling the response, either at the ground spraying level or aerial spraying, so that they can do the job that they need to do to respond quickly. So governments are very overwhelmed at the moment. Many of them are working remotely for the first time ever with very limited tools for doing so effectively, and they're trying to figure this all out very, very quickly. Sometimes communication between national level government and local level government is weak. And those things are all impacting the ability of people to work in the field as quickly as they need to. So I think advocacy and clear recommendations to governments about what specific activities need to be allowed under things like what needs to be an exception to a curfew. The Kenyan government has an overnight curfew right now that ends at 5 o'clock in the morning. Does the pilot need to be able to get to the airport at 4 a.m. to go out and do the aerial spraying? If so, that person needs to have something in writing that allows them to drive, get transportation to that airport, so that if they're stopped by the police, they can still go. These things seem incredibly minor, but in fact could be some of the things that end up blocking a very rapid response in a period of time that's very time sensitive, this next month of ground control and aerial spraying.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. I'd like to ask a question about climate change now. We haven't discussed that in specific, but Dominique, you did mention the importance of off-cycle cyclones, of unusually high amounts of rain, in leading to these large swarms in the first place. And we have a question about what role, if any, could climate adaptation play in future alleviation of locust intensity?
Well, first of all, if you allow, I'd just like to comment a bit more on the previous one as well, to say that, of course, FAO is fully engaged with academic institutions. I mean, there's still a lot of research work that needs to take place and that needs to be applied. So we are even engaged with quite a large number of US universities, Columbia University, California, and many others, where we are also working on surveillance, including, for example, crowdsourcing. I said that if you need to be able, the problem with locust is that the target is moving, so you need to be able to find your target to be able to spray. So it means crowdsourcing is a direction we are going more and more. We are also working on modeling of the trajectory of locusts, so which for us is absolutely important. Now, when it comes to climate change, I mean, we need always to be very careful on whether we attribute to climate change per se or not. What we have seen is that indeed over the last couple of the last 2-3 years, essentially there has been an increased number of cyclones. I mean, the ones that have first come on the Arabic Peninsula, bringing huge quantities of water in the empty quarter, that have allowed the development of this desert locust upsurge, and then the one that was, I would say, the killer one that was found in December, which is totally unforeseen, and again brought huge quantities of water. So now I would say, when it comes to desert locust operations, the adaptation would be indeed to further strengthen capacities in terms of surveillance, prediction, and capacities of the government, so that at the very, very early beginning we are able to knock down the situation, even when it is of an unforeseen capacity. This can be by working indeed at the country level, but also, as Matt was saying, with some sub-regional capacities that need to be that also need to be to exist and be further supported.
Okay, thank you so much, Dominique. And final words on anything to add?
I think just very quickly, regardless of climate change, locusts are here. They will continue to be a threat as we go forward. And just as Dominique said, we need to have great surveillance and strong regional and local ability to combat this. Trying to scale up huge responses every time, I don't think is going to be really the best approach to this. That local capacity, collectively getting the surveillance needed, I think that those are proven methods, and we need to keep the eye on those as well.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Matt. I think that those are some excellent final words. We've come upon our ending time. It's 11:15 now. And so I'd like to thank you and our other panelists, Stephanie, Matt, Dominique, for joining us today. I'd also like to thank the FAO's Liaison Office for North America for their partnership in bringing this event together. And finally, I'd like to thank the CSIS Global Food Security Team, Christian Mann, Eilish Zimbilci, and Sydney Smith, and the CSIS External Relations Team for producing this event. And I'd like to thank our audience for tuning in from all around the world. For more information, please visit us at csis.org, and please follow us on Twitter at CSISFood. Again, thank you all.